Hi, it's Leslie Terebesi again, and today I want to talk a little bit about my upcoming book, another upcoming book, so to speak, in which I try to identify basically, how do I put this? Once again, what actually went wrong, according to my reading of the Muslim intellectual and political history, what went wrong in the world of Islam, intellectually mainly, but of course, as I mentioned, it has political ramifications, and what can be done about it. I'm sure you already know that a number of people have addressed this question, including, most of the people that wanted to achieve a renewal of the Muslim civilization, people like Fazlur Rahman, Rashid Rida, maybe Muhammad Abdu, and many others that have participated in this project of attempting to renew the Muslim civilization. Some people have been called modernists, others have been called reformers. Even non-Muslims have taken an interest in this question. For example, we have Bernard Lewis, who wrote an article and called "What Went Wrong," and I think he has a book on the subject with a similar title. So now, basically, my analysis is based on my work in an Islamic university here in Malaysia, where I worked for 5 years as a lecturer, and I coordinated the English program for a year as well. Although my main focus was not on Islamic studies, it was I was basically teaching and helping to teach English, including subjects like Shakespeare from an Islamic perspective, or creative writing, English for special purposes, and also a general English studies course. However, of course, during my 5 years at the university, I encountered and I managed to learn a little bit more about Islam than I knew until then. This learning process continued after my departure from the university at the International Institute of Advanced Islamic Studies, also here in Malaysia, where I stayed for a period of 10 years, working basically as an editor and researcher, and I also began to write stuff of my own, so to speak. I think I started with a book review, and then it went on from there to bigger projects like points of view and full papers, and even one or two books. So over the course of these years, I have been observing, and studying the Muslim intellectual and political history. Perhaps I should add also that I came to Islam from a background in philosophy. I learned about philosophy in Canada. I basically have a Canadian passport, although I originally hail from Eastern Europe, from a country that doesn't exist anymore. In fact, you may have heard of Czechoslovakia, which is now divided into two countries. Some people call the first half of it Czechia, and the other one is called Slovakia. I'm from the Slovakia part of it. However, if you are interested ethnically, I am of something of a mixed background. My grandmother was Austrian, my grandfather was Hungarian, and my mother informed me that her parents apparently came from France some years before that. Anyway, coming back to the main subject. So, what went wrong in Muslim intellectual history? And I basically traced it or developed the argument or the analysis into 10 steps basically. But perhaps I can mention that initially my analysis consisted of a single step, and this single step basically transpired around 2017 after I left the research institute, and however I left the research institute, and but I did continue doing work in this area. There were some unanswered questions still with me, and I was writing. I was putting this down on paper as well. So in fact, there was a time we were having one of our vacations in neighboring Thailand, Koh Samui to be precise. For me, these vacations normally are working holidays. I normally spend 3 or 4 hours a day, maybe a bit longer sometimes, in what I call my office, which is one of the Starbucks coffee shops, where you can get, I suppose, a decent cup of coffee, but also access to internet, and you can work for a few hours, using the internet facilities provided there. So I was basically doing a paper on, I think, abrogation, and I began to sense that something really did go wrong, which in the Muslim intellectual and political history, which kind of passed me by. I did not really, as it were, catch on to it, what exactly that was. And I remember thinking about this question. It was weighing on my mind, you might say, for 2 or 3 days, until on about the third day, suddenly I had this, I don't know, shall I call it a flash of insight? This one word just popped into my brain, and I said, I immediately realized that this is the word that captures what went wrong or what happened in the entire Muslim intellectual history. So this was a very general way. Now, what was that one word I should mention? That one word was the word eclipse. Eclipse. I'm sure you know what that word means. Normally, when we use the word eclipse, we are referring to the, let's say, the eclipse of the sun by the moon, which takes place when the moon, the sun, and the earth align in the same line, which means that the moon begins to block much, although not all, of the light of the sun that is coming to us. So generally, a kind of semi-darkness descends on the world whenever the moon eclipses the sun. So I thought and I realized that what happened in something similar happened in Islamic or Muslim intellectual history. The light that we were receiving from the Quran, the enlightenment of the Quran, the enlightening book, this light was being blocked by something else, something like the moon. And what was this thing that was blocking the light of the sun, so to speak? Well, I concluded, and I hope my viewers aren't going to get offended if I when I say this, but I concluded that the very thing that was blocking this light was nothing other than what we think of as Islamic tradition. Okay, tradition. Yes, you heard me correctly. Now, what do I mean by that? Of course, tradition is a very broad term, but when I use the term tradition, I normally mean the basically the traditional practices of Muslims, which of course ideally are expected to reflect the teaching of the Quran. However, in reality, that does not always happen. Sometimes the tradition veers away, you might say, from the revelation. And whenever that happens, of course, a problem arises because if we are bent on, as the majority of the Muslim world, I believe, accepts this as a kind of a given. If we follow tradition, which has, we are expected to follow tradition, let me put it this way, together with revelation. What I'm suggesting is that the following of the tradition appears to have eclipsed or somehow overshadowed or surpassed even that which gave rise to the tradition in the first place, which is revelation or the Quran. Now, when I use the word tradition, I also mean what are known as the prophetic traditions, in other words, the hadiths or the ahadiths, which are also equated by some, but not everyone, with the Sunnah of the Prophet. So now, the equating the Sunnah of the Prophet with the Hadith was something that was achieved by one of the four leading Imams, and that was Imam al-Shafi'i. Other Imams did not, it seems, make this, equation of the Sunnah with the hadith, but that's another question. Let's for the time being assume that indeed the Sunnah of the Prophet is basically the same as the hadith, or perhaps we could more precisely say that we could ask, how do we know the Sunnah? And the short answer is that, well, we know the Sunnah from the hadith, so there is, after all, a very close link between the Sunnah and the hadith. So now the Sunnah or the hadith are, as you know, those of you who are familiar with basic principles of jurisprudence, the Sunnah and the Hadith or the Hadith constitute the second source of Islamic law in traditional Islamic jurisprudence. The first source being, of course, Al Quran, or what we Muslims believe is the word of Allah. So now, what I'm suggesting is, and I'm not alone in this, by the way, there are other people who have spoken on this. For example, Muhammad Shahrur, in his book called Quran, Morality and Critical Reason, published in Damascus, Syria in 2009. And by the way, an English translation is available online, free, in PDF format. Another person, a well known scholar who commented on this issue, was the late Taha Jabir al Wani, in his book published in 2017 by the Triple IT Institute based in Herndon, Virginia, USA. And the name of the book the name of the book is Reviving the Balance. I think he was referring to the balance between the Quran and the Sunnah. So both of these gentlemen, in fact, realized that there is an issue here, that perhaps the relationship between the Quran and Sunnah was not entirely correctly articulated, and that it requires a reappraisal. More precisely, what these gentlemen argue in these books I mentioned, and I basically incline to that view as well, is that somehow the Sunnah or the Hadith have overshadowed the Quran, and this means that we need to reaffirm the primacy of the Quran as the first and foremost, some would even say the only real source of legislation in Islamic law. So I don't want to get into the question now of how many sources of the law there are in Islam. That we can maybe consider that question at another time. What I want to focus on is what what was the significance of this eclipse of revelation by tradition. Basically, what it meant was that there was a sort of turn that has taken place by the Muslim community, and this turn was a turn from basically revelation or the Quran towards tradition or the Sunnah or the Hadith. So this turn was a very big event, I feel, and perhaps not entirely, how do I put it, justified. And I will go into a few reasons shortly for saying this. Because as Muslims, we accept that the authority of Allah is paramount, and the every other authority has to be subordinated and is subordinate to the authority of Allah. No authority can ever be placed above the authority of Allah. However, when we look at Islamic intellectual history, we see actually something quite different. What we see is that some authority or even authorities have in fact been placed above the Quran or the revelation, and this presents a problem for the teaching of also not just the supremacy of Allah and the sovereignty of Allah, but also it raises a question whether this placing other authorities above the authority of the Quran is actually consistent with the principle of Tawheed. So now, how did this all happen? This is where I want to go back to the beginning and start with the observation that, to the best of my ability, my analysis tells me that this whole process of distortion of our knowledge of the Quran began with first with what I call a kind of misstep very early in Muslim intellectual history. And this misstep was basically the belittling of reason or rationality or akal, which is the Arabic word for the intellect. And that development, the belittling of reason or rationality, or the marginalization of rationality and its subordination to tradition, basically, as it were, kicked off this process of gradual change and eventual disintegration in the longer term of the Islamic civilization. So, all right, we have covered the first steps, but perhaps I can add a footnote to it. How or why did reason suffer this fate? What was the reason for characterizing reason as something that is should not be emphasized too much? Well, this allegation against reason, you could use a stronger word, you could think of it as a kind of slander of reason, actually arose out of the disputes between two groups of people in early Muslim history, whom we can perhaps designate as the rationalists on the one hand, the Ahlil al-Ra'i, or the people of opinion, and the Ahlil al-Hadith, or the people of tradition. You see, each of these groups represents a different approach to the question of what is the best way to understand and apply revelation, but first understand revelation. The rationalists argue basically that the human intellect is sufficient for the understanding of the Quran, while the traditionists argue that, well, the human intellect is somehow flawed or weak, and therefore it is insufficient for a full comprehension of the teaching of revelation. We need something else. And as we will see, this something else will turn out to be none other than the Sunnah, or the tradition or traditions of the Prophet. So it was within the context of this struggle between the rationalists and the traditionists that the traditionists came up with this one prophetic tradition, which I personally believe may have been or was fabricated. Why do I say that? Because it runs so directly and contrary to the teaching of the Quran. Anyway, according to this tradition, the Prophet allegedly said that the use of reason based exegesis or tafsir is a form of kufr or disbelief. Now, a reference to this tradition may be found in a paper written by Adis Duderija, which is available on academia, and the title of the paper is Neo-Salafism, the Case of Abu Amin Bilal Phillips. So, this tradition basically did several things. It not only belittled the reason and essentially discouraged people from using their reason to understand revelation, because who would want to be accused of being a kafir on the grounds that he was actually using his own mind to try to understand revelation? So the first effect or impact of this tradition was to discourage people from associating themselves even with reason and from using reason to understand revelations. So that was the first misstep. I have altogether identified 10 of these steps. So this is the first of the 10 step, or you could even think of it as a mistake. 10 mistakes or 10 errors that led to these the problems that the Muslim Ummah is experiencing. So it was the first misstep was the belittling or of reason or human rationality. We will see that later on this trend continued and found various additional manifestations, including political ones, in out of a total of 4 cases, I think. So that was the first mistake. So now, what was the next or the second mistake in this process, or the second misstep? The second misstep in this process was that because of this bad reputation given to reason by the traditionist, the people who wanted to follow tradition rather than rely on reason to understand revelation, the first effect, as I mentioned, was to discourage people from using their reason, and therefore, when it came to reading the Quran, The second mistake here was, I would describe it as a failure to engage reason for the purpose of understanding the Quran, right? So, in the first step, the reason or rationality was belittled and discredited by associating its use in a process of understanding revelation with disbelief or kufr. That was the first mistake, the belittling of reason, and the second mistake was the failure to use reason to understand revelation. As you can see, how the second mistake follows from the first mistake. There's a close link. So now, what was the what were the effects of the second mistake? The first effect of the second mistake was that people who were reading the Quran without using their reason began to encounter difficulties in comprehending the Quran. And this is hardly surprising, because who could comprehend anything, let alone the Quran, without using his or her reason? So I think this was the misunderstanding or a reduced knowledge of the Quran was a direct result of the failure to engage reason in the process of understanding revelation. In other words, the rejection of reason based tafsir, which, according to the problematic hadith I mentioned earlier, was what we should all be doing. The rejection of this reason based tafsir resulted or clearly contributed to a reduced knowledge of the Quran. To be more specific, the Quran began to appear to those exegetes who were refraining from using their reason. The Quran or the revelation began to appear to them as, and there were three separate issues here, three separate problems, so to speak. First, they began to encounter what they thought of as ambiguous words or verses. So they began to claim that there was ambiguity in the Quran, that there were ambiguous words. The second, thing, or the second way in which the second effect of not using their reason was that the Quran began to strike them as incomplete. You see, so in response to that, they basically alleged that there were some things missing from the Quran. For example, details on how to pray. The third anomaly, as it were, that resulted from the reluctance to use reason to understand revelation, the third sort of problem which arose was the, the that the some Quranic verses began to strike the exegetes as inconsistent with one another. In other words, as contradictory. And in fact, they began to see contradictions, in other words, where there was no contradiction. Because let's recall that, by the way, all of these three, developments or anomalies or charges against the Quran are flatly contradicted by the Quran itself, which claims that it is not only clear, ambiguous, haza kitabul mubin, the Quran says very clearly, and but these claims also contradict the statements in the Quran which present the revelation as complete and fully detailed. In other words, nothing has been left out from the Quran. And thirdly, the Quran also presents itself as coherent without any contradictions. So all these three characterizations by the exegetes who were not really using their reason to the fullest, all these three characterizations of the Quran go directly against the teaching of the Quran itself, and in fact depart from that teaching. So I think this alone is quite problematic, because if you as a Muslim believe that the Quran is the word of God, would you not expect that everything the Quran says, including what it says about itself, is true? But the exegetes who were not inclined to use their reason began to make claims that actually, no, the Quran has not lived up to its claim that it is a clear, completely clear book. In some cases, some of the exegetes even mistranslate the word mutashabihad as meaning ambiguous. In verse 7 of Surah number 3, the word mutashabihad does not mean ambiguous. it means allegorical or metaphorical. So here is another mistake among the other mistakes I mentioned. So, and also, as I mentioned, the Quran presents itself as fully detailed and coherent. So the exegetes, like I said, who were not inclined to use their reason, began to find fault with the Quran, and the other two faults were, as I mentioned, they alleged that the Quran was incomplete and also incoherent. All three claims, as I mentioned, are contradicted by the Quran. So, in other words, by making these claims, the exegetes are basically expressing doubts about the veracity of the Quran. I'm not saying that they are rejecting those verses, but they certainly seem to be having doubts whether the Quran is as perfect as it presents itself. Because let us recall, the Quran presents itself as perfect, fully detailed, clear. Yet some of these exegetes, who, like I said, were not inclined to use their reason, began to find all kinds of faults in the Quran, and basically by doing so, they began to question the perfection of the revelation, and even they began to question the inimitability of the Quran, meaning the Quran is unlike any other document, and it is basically not possible to produce anything similar to or equal to it. So this was the third mistake, basically, after the failure to use reason, was the characterization of the Quran as basically faulty or flawed, as basically containing passages that are ambiguous, that also the part of the mistake. The mistake takes three forms. The first form of the mistake was the claim that the Quran is ambiguous. The second false allegation basically was that the Quran is incomplete, and the third false allegation was that the Quran is incoherent. So, designating the Quran as being unclear, incomplete, and incoherent, that was the third, what I call the third mistake. It was a mischaracterization of the Quran. Now, this mistake then necessitated the fourth error, which was in fact actually a response to the third mistake or the third error. And what was this fourth error? Well, the fourth mistake or the fourth error was what I call the turn from revelation to tradition. Because the exegetes, who were not using their reason to its full capacity, wanted to find a way to address what they thought were these alleged weaknesses in the Quran, and they did it in two ways basically. The first two alleged weaknesses of the Quran, its ambiguity and its incompleteness, they suggested could be rectified by turning to an outside source, namely the hadith or the traditions, to help us explain the meaning of these alleged ambiguous verses, and to supply, secondly, to us the details of what they claimed was missing from the Quran, for example, details on how to pray. So these two problems were going to be resolved by going to the prophetic traditions or the hadith. In other words, they were going to be resolved by going outside of the Quran. Despite this was done, and people resolved to do this despite the claim that in the Quran that the Quran is complete, fully detailed, and leaves nothing out. So according to the Quran, there should be no reason to go outside of the Quran. But because the exegetes have mischaracterized the Quran, that's how they open the door, so to speak, to going outside of the Quran, to outside or external sources, to help clarify and complete the Quran. Now, for the third weakness, the alleged incoherence or contradictory nature of some parts of the Quran, the exegetes also proposed going outside of the Quran, this time to a doctrine or a teaching that, by the way, is actually quite alien to the Quran. And this teaching I'm referring to is the teaching of abrogation. They suggested that the alleged contradictory nature of the verses in the Quran can be resolved or reconciled by basically abrogating verses revealed earlier by verses revealed later among the verses that appeared to contradict each other. So this was their solution. Of course, I have done some videos on the doctrine of abrogation. Six of them are on academia, available to premium subscribers, but there's a shorter video on YouTube on that, and I also have one interview with James Stein where I talk about abrogation, and another video with Mufti Abu Layth where I also touch on the issue of abrogation. So perhaps you could consult those sources. I also have two or three papers, I believe, on the doctrine of abrogation in academia as well, and a book, by the way, on Amazon.com. The book is called "Does the Final Testament Abrogate the Old and New Testaments?" So these are some additional sources that you may want to consult. In the meantime, I will say that the even though the classical exegetes, some of them found as many as 500 cases of abrogation, which is enormous, quite unbelievable. Although at the lower end we find Shah Waliullah, who only identified, I believe, five cases of contradictory verses and therefore five cases of abrogation of the Quran by the Quran. But I'd like to point out that nearly all the modern contemporary, writers on the subject pretty much agree that there is no such thing as abrogation in the Quran, none whatsoever. And it started perhaps with Abu Muslim al Isfahani in the old days, who claimed that there is no abrogation in the Quran, and he was in a minority at the time. He made this claim on the basis of the three verses in Al Quran where Allah says that we will never find any change in the words of Allah. Now, those verses basically rule out any kind of change, any kind of abrogation of the Quran by the Quran, because any kind of abrogation would require us to basically to change the words of Allah, and we cannot do that according to the Quran. But anyway, some of the other people who rejected the doctrine of abrogation included Muhammad Abdu, Rashid Rida, even Ismail Farouki, Taj Abir Alwani, Fazlur Rahman, Muhammad Assad. I think I already mentioned Muhammad Abdu, and then there's Muhammad Ghazali, and I believe those are the main people who have rejected, the doctrine of abrogation. So anyway, so now come back to the third mistake. As I mentioned, the third mistake was the characterization of the Quran is somehow flawed. The fourth mistake was turning from revelation from the Quran to the tradition to compensate, as it were, for the alleged deficiencies of the Quran. So now this turn from the Quran to the tradition was a very important turn. There's a verse in the Quran where the Prophet allegedly will say on the Day of Judgment that, my Lord, my people have abandoned this Quran. That we, the Muslim community, have actually abandoned the Quran for something else. Now, is this what is happening when their exegetes began to turn from the revelation to the tradition? Because what we see here is a growing trend towards more and more attention being paid to tradition rather than to revelation, and that is problematic. However, there was one glitch with the turn from revelation to tradition. You see, to explain an ambiguous verse in the Quran could not be done with the hadith as long as the hadith was considered something other than revelation itself, because in the Quran there are three verses in Surah Al-Ma'idah, chapter 5, verses 44, 45, and 47, which say basically that anyone who judges by what Allah has not revealed is in fact committing kufr. He's a kafir, zalim, or a fasik. So, since explaining the Quran with the Hadith requires judging the Quran with the Hadith, the exegetes could not do it as long as the Hadith was understood to be something other than revelation. In other words, in order for them to use the Hadith to explain or to judge the Quran, they had to elevate the Hadith or the tradition to or to designate it as revelation also, like the Quran, and that's exactly what they did. That's how they got out of this quagmire, as it were, the dilemma of how can you judge the Quran by something that is itself not revelation. So they basically declared that no, the Hadith or the Sunnah is also revelation, and they even designed a name for it. They called it the so-called concealed revelation or hidden revelation. In Arabic, the term is wahi batin, and they refer to the Quran as the explicit or manifest revelation or wahi zahir. However, we see a problem even with the expression wahi batin because I mean the very expression seems to suggest that there wasn't a whole lot of reflection in coming to this expression to use this expression, because you may well ask, well, how can something which is revealed be concealed at the same time? The expression concealed or hidden revelation seems to be, in other words, an oxymoron. So what do we do with that? Anyway, let's move on and then basically what I'm trying to say is that yes, the exegetes decided in order for them in order to be able to explain the revelation by recourse to tradition, they pretty much felt obliged to elevate tradition to the rank of revelation, and in fact even they would treat the hadith or the tradition as equal, to revelation of the Quran. But I'll get to that in a minute. So this decision to designate tradition as revelation, as wahi, was the fifth error in the series of errors. So now the support for equating tradition with revelation was once again found in another hadith, which I also believe was probably fabricated because it runs against the teaching of the Quran quite clearly. And the hadith apparently says that the Prophet allegedly said that I was given two things, the Quran and something equal to it, the hadith. Now, this hadith you can find on the website of Ibn Baz, who was, or maybe still is, I think he was, the chief cleric in Saudi Arabia, the Mufti of Saudi Arabia. In other words, basically representing the highest religious authority at the time in Saudi Arabia. You can find this hadith on his website, but you can also find the reference to this hadith in books by the two writers I mentioned, Muhammad Shahrur and Tahajabir Alwani, who both refer to this hadith in a very similar context in which I'm talking about it. So basically, the hadith was made into a partner of the Quran. So now, in fact, Ibn Baz says on the same website that I refer to that he doesn't only quote the hadith, he goes so far as to say that he uses the word sunnah. The sunnah is, in fact, a part of the Quran, right? So the sunnah becomes, as it were, one with the Quran. Now, is this possible? What exactly does he mean by that? And he also says in a separate line that the Sunnah cannot be separated from the Quran. So, does it become a single document? What is going on here? As I noted as I have written in a book that I'm preparing on a subject, and which I hope will be published perhaps in 3 days or so. I've had to postpone the publication date because I've encountered a few glitches in it, so I am trying to resolve those glitches. Hopefully, it won't take too long. But anyway, what is the problem with this characterization of tradition as a revelation? Well, first, as I mentioned, to designate the tradition or the hadith as part of revelation, in fact, as part of the Quran, is to give a partner to the Quran. Now, the question that may arise in your mind, we know that Allah has no partners, right? So if He has no partners, how can His words have any partners? What are we talking about here? Don't you think it's a bit dangerous to say that the traditions, the 6 books of traditions, Sahih Bukhari, Sahih Muslim, and all the others, don't you think it's a little bit problematic to say that these are books of revelation in addition to the Quran, which are moreover equal to the Quran? Don't you think it's a bit problematic, or maybe more than a bit problematic? So does the Quran have 6 partners? The books I mentioned, which are equal to the Quran. So the Quran is not inimitable after all. People can produce something similar to it or equal to it even. So when the hadiths were declared as revelation, basically the people took up the challenge. In the Quran, Allah is challenging those people who didn't believe the Quran was a revelation from Him. He basically challenged them, okay, if you don't believe this is coming from Allah, then produce at least 10 surahs like this, or at least one surah, and you will never be able to do it. Well, true, the people who assembled the books of the Hadith were not able to produce something equal or similar to the Quran. Nevertheless, they certainly tried, right? They certainly made an attempt. And the proof is in the existence of the six books of the traditions that we have. So, quite honestly, can we treat these books as equals of the Quran without treating their authors as equals of Allah? What do you think about that? I'm not going to answer the questions. You be the judge. Judge for yourself. But I think there's a huge problem here. A very great risk of something that is forbidden in Islam. That is of associating things with Allah that He has given no authority for. And are we not aware of the fact that in Surah 69, verses 44 and 46 to 46, Allah says very clearly to the Prophet that if he were to add anything in our name, we would take him by the hand and cut off his artery. That is a clear warning against adding to the revelation of the Quran any additional revelation. Well, of course, the Prophet didn't do it. In fact, the Prophet himself prohibited the same thing when he said, "Do not write anything from me, and if anyone has written something from me, let him destroy it." And Abu Bakr destroyed 500 hadiths that he had. And Omar apparently reprimanded some people for doing the same thing. So both Allah and the Prophet basically prohibited the recording of the hadiths. And if we, believe the Quran, which says that we have to obey both Allah and the Prophet, no one is allowed to add any additional revelation to the Quran. Yet it happened. So how do we interpret that? Do the addition of the hadith mean that some people have disobeyed the prohibition of adding to the Quran, a prohibition made both by Allah and the Messenger? Is that what happened? Okay, I'll leave the answer to you. Think about it. Judge for yourself. I will, in the meantime, move on to the sixth mistake. So that was the fifth mistake. The designation of tradition as equal as revelation, and moreover as equal to revelation, equal to the Quran. That was very problematic. So what happened next? There are still five more mistakes to come. The sixth mistake was, it seems that the exegetes were not happy with simply making the tradition or the hadith equal to revelation. So they went ahead and actually elevated the tradition above revelation. In fact, they had to do it, I should put it this way, because after all, they wanted to use the hadith to judge the revelation, right? So they had to basically elevate it to a level higher than revelation itself, and they did it when they declared that the Sunnah or the hadith judge or the revelation. In Arabic, the expression is as-Sunnah qadiya ala Quran. The Sunnah judges the revelation of the Quran. This is what they basically said. Now, don't you think there's a problem with this statement? After all, the Quran presents itself as the book to us as the book of explanation, clarifying all things. But here come some exegetes and tell us that the prophetic traditions, who are basically narrations by ordinary human beings who were not prophets and they were not messengers, that the narrations of these people are going to help Allah, effectively, in effect, help Him make Himself clear. Now, what kind of claim is that? Are they suggesting to us that Allah needs help from His own creatures to help Him make Himself clear? Is that the suggestion? This is very problematic. Anyway, let me continue. So they the exegetes pretty much had to elevate the tradition above revelation in order to basically provide this explanation to the alleged unclear verses, and also to basically provide details that Allah somehow did not include in the Quran, which again is a suggestion. Indirectly, they are suggesting that, are they suggesting to us that Allah was somehow forgetful, that He forgot to include details on how to pray in the Quran? Is that what the suggestion is? I mean, don't you think it's perhaps more than a little disrespectful to Allah to say that He revealed verses that are not entirely clear, which therefore have to be clarified by some of His own creatures? And don't you think it is more than a little disrespectful to claim that some details have to be provided? I mean, that the Quran has to be somehow that the people need to, the hadiths need to provide the details of some things that Allah somehow forgot to include in the Quran. Are they suggesting that Allah Ta'ala has these human qualities of being forgetful and also of not expressing himself with full clarity? Is that what they are doing? I think these claims are very, very problematic. Nevertheless, they have been made, and another way in which this claim was made of the superiority of the Sunnah of the Quran was is clear from the statement, also popular among the exegetes even until today, and a statement of the principle says that the Quran needs the Sunnah more than the Sunnah needs the Quran. Now, how can anybody in his right mind say something like that? Without the Quran, there would be no Sunnah in the first place. And now they are subordinating the Quran to the Sunnah? Have they lost their minds, if I can put it directly? Well, didn't I say at the beginning that some of these people refused to use their minds? So what happened? Is this a result of refraining from using one's mind? When you stop thinking, is this what's going to happen? Or when you reduce your reliance on your akal? And how many times does Allah remind us to use our reason in the Quran? Afala takilun, will you not use your reason? Is repeated so many times, and many other expressions of a similar nature are all over the Quran. So what happened? Why this hostility towards rationality? And you can see the results of this bias against rationality. The results begin to look pretty catastrophic, if you ask me. It didn't stop there. The elevation of tradition continued, and that was the seventh mistake of the exegetes. So they were not happy even with the tradition judging the revelation. They wanted to raise it even higher, so that the hadith now could do something it could not do before, which was to abrogate or cancel parts of revelation. Can you believe this? What are the hadiths? They are not even the words of the Prophet, because the hadiths are paraphrases of paraphrases. So here the exegetes are telling us that the paraphrases of the words of the Prophet have the authority to abrogate the words of God. What what is going on here? How can they say something like that? Don't you think this is problematic? I think it is very problematic. And it didn't stop there. There was one more step in the elevation of tradition or the hadith above revelation. Or what was this step? This step was the claim that the eighth mistake, that the hadith is not only equal to the Quran, is not only a judge of the Quran. It can not only abrogate or cancel parts of the Quran, but it can even replace parts of the Quran. Yes, you heard me correctly. I said replace. And how does that happen? Well, it already did happen. Replacement of parts of the Quran took place when the punishments for adultery and apostasy that were specified in the Quran were replaced by punishments which were specified in the Hadith. Yeah? The Quran does not specify any punishment for apostasy in this life, and in fact the Prophet never put anyone to death for apostasy. But the Hadith specifies the death penalty for apostasy. The Hadith is kind of extreme, if you ask me. The Quran is not extreme. The Hadith is here, in this case, seems quite extreme because it prescribes the extreme punishment, which is death. Now, on what grounds did these exegetes, or in this case jurists, feel justified in replacing the words of Allah with the words of a human being? Ikrimah, who narrated this hadith on the authority of Ibn Abbas. On what grounds do they feel that they can justify replacing the words of Allah with the words of human beings? Please enlighten me if I'm missing something. And that hadith, by the way, is a solitary hadith. Nobody else heard the Prophet say this except one 13-year-old boy, because that's how old Ibn Abbas was at the time that he allegedly heard this hadith. Very problematic. And something similar is true with the punishment for adultery. The Quran specifies a punishment of 100 lashes upon conviction of adultery on the basis of four witnesses. In the entire history of Islam, 1400 years, there has not been a single conviction of adultery based on the testimony of the four witnesses. Yeah, it's a proof which is very hard to meet. People normally don't do this kind of a thing in public. Yeah, so it never happened. But the jurists were not happy with this punishment of 100 lashes. They wanted something stronger. Are they suggesting to us that they are able to they are going to improve on Allah's legislation? Are they placing themselves above Allah? Well, because they prescribed something completely different. Instead of sticking with what Allah prescribed in the Quran, they came up with a different punishment for adultery. Once again, an extreme punishment for adultery, which is the punishment of death by stoning. So the fact that these exegetes, jurists, are prescribing death penalties, extreme penalties, where Allah does not prescribe extreme penalties, does that make them look a little bit like extremists? If you ask me, don't you think it's a little bit extreme to prescribe? In fact, don't you think that it is kind of when they prescribe a punishment which is stronger and different from what Allah prescribed in the Quran, do you think that they are still within the hudud, the limits of provided by Allah, or are they actually crossing those limits? They are violating by prescribing penalties that Allah did not prescribe, and penalties which are harsher than the ones that Allah prescribed. Don't you think that they are transgressing the limits that Allah prescribed, the hudud that Allah prescribed in the Quran? And these is Muslim jurists are doing this. So what do you do with that? How do you do with that? And they say this is part of the Sharia. Is it? How can it be part of the Sharia if it is not part of the Quran? That's another question we can consider, but perhaps at another time. Now that leaves two more mistakes. What were these remaining two mistakes? Mistake number 8 was when the ulama themselves declared themselves capable of abrogating the words of Allah, right? So what they are telling us is it's not only Abu Fulan or Ibn Fulan, a transmitter of the hadith, that is able to abrogate the words of Allah, but they claim that right for themselves too. They say we not only the hadith, but we also can abrogate or overrule essentially Allah or Allah's rulings in the Quran. And what proof do I have for saying this? Well, this is documented in the literature. There was an Imam, his name was Imam Abul Hasan al-Karhi. He was a Hanafite scholar who declared famously, and both Al-Wani and Shahru refer to this statement. He declared that if anything that we say, meaning our school of thought, contradicts with the Quran, consider the Quran to be abrogated. Can you believe this? So their words, the words of the scholars, the ulama, overrule the words of Allah. My God, where do they get the audacity to say something like that? Are they placing themselves above Allah? Have they lost their mind? Well, what did I say? What was the first mistake? The first mistake was to belittle the use of the mind. The second mistake was the failure to use the mind. And here we see, I fear, additional evidence of the failure to use one's mind. I'm sorry if I'm being a little too harsh, but that's how I see what happened, and I know I'm not alone, because as I mentioned, both Alwani and Shahrur touch on these points as well in the respective books I mentioned. So now what was the last mistake? The last mistake was very similar to another one that came earlier when we said that the ulama claimed that the hadith can abrogate and replace the revelation, the Quran, parts of the Quran. Well, the ulama pretty much said the same thing. They claimed that, well, our words, rulings can abrogate the rulings of Allah, and the last claim, the 10th mistake, was the claim that these rulings or teachings can also replace parts of the teaching of Allah. Replace, right? Can you believe this? Okay, so now what evidence do I have for that? Well, as you know, Islam presents itself as a religion of peace. The Quran is full of verses counseling peace and reconciliation. But what did the ulama do? When they came up with the doctrine of abrogation, they asserted, falsely in my opinion, that one verse in the Quran, the so-called verse of the sword in Surah number 9, verse number 5, abrogated no fewer than 120 verses which counsel peace and reconciliation. Amazing. So they are trying to tell us that Allah decided suddenly to abrogate 120 of his verses, all of which teach peace. Now, what is left once you take out the peace from the religion? What is left? What is left of the? What is there to support Islam as a religion of peace? Well, I think if you cancel or abrogate 120 peace verses, there's going to be a change in your understanding of the teaching of the Quran, and that's exactly what happened. The ulama, by claiming that the verse 5 in Surah number 9 abrogated 120 peace verses, essentially what they did was they transformed what we know as a religion of peace into, are you ready for this? A religion of war. Exactly, you heard me correctly. And by the way, there was someone well known that said exactly that. He said that Islam, I quote, was always a religion of war, end of quote. Do you know who that was who said these words? Well, it was none other than Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi. Yes, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, the leader of ISIS, said those words. So he was following the traditional exegesis of the Quran when he declared that Islam was always a religion of war. Islam was never a religion of war. It was always a religion of peace. It is the some of the ulama, I refer to them as the hawkish ulama, that made or transformed Islam as a religion of peace into a religion of war and conquest. You can find more information on this question in Shahrur's book, chapter 6, where he goes into quite a bit of detail on how this happened. I don't want to take too much time, but basically what he's saying is that the rulers of the time, the caliphs who wanted to go on raids of neighboring countries, needed a religious justification for doing so, and some of the ulama obligingly provided them with a reinterpretation of the teaching of the Quran, which not only allowed spreading Islam by the sword, but even made it a requirement. And this war, aggressive war, because the Quran, as we know, allows fighting. Yes, it does allow, but only in self-defense and in some cases of oppression. There shall be no aggression except against the aggressors, oppressors, is a verse in the Quran. So now the ulama have supplied this reinterpretation of the teaching of revelation, which not only permits but even requires Muslim rulers to engage what is called the jihad al-talab, or the aggressive war. In other words, the ulama have transformed the meaning of jihad as the lesser jihad. They transformed its meaning from waging war in self-defense to waging war, offensive war, to spread Islam by the sword. This is known as the doctrine of jihad al-talab. You can find papers online. There's one paper, for example, by Hamad Mawani, called The Tension Between Quran and Sunnah. It's online in free in PDF format. You can read more about it. Another paper that talks about it is a paper by Niyaz Aisha, that's S-A-H, S-H-A-H. The name of the paper is Use of Force in Islamic Law, and the paper has been published by the European Journal of International Relations and republished by Oxford University Press. But of course, you can find also, as I mentioned, information in Shahrur's book on this and in other sources, I'm sure. So the ulama basically replaced the teaching of peace espoused by Allah in the Quran by articulation of Islam, basically as a religion of conquest and war. That was terrible because, among other things, it also gave some ammunition, so to speak, intellectual ammunition, I mean, to the people who still claim that we Muslims have to wage war against the kafirs, the disbelievers, even when the disbelievers are not attacking us. This view was spread, for example, by Said Qutb and also by Maududi in Pakistan, And also, this view was supported by another doctrine which is also alien to the Quran, and that is the doctrine of the so-called inevitable conflict or clash between the Darul Islam and the Darul Harb, or Darul Kufr as it is sometimes referred to. And that doctrine of this inevitable clash between Darul Islam and the Darul Harb actually is very similar to the so-called doctrine of the clash of civilizations propounded by Samuel Huntington recently to provide a theoretical or ideological justification for the so-called war on terror. So yeah, how do I put this? Some Muslim brothers are fond of pointing out to us that many things that the Western people now have, the Muslims had it first. Well, we can extend that generalization also to the doctrine of the inevitable clash of civilizations, because it seems that this doctrine is also among those things that at least some of the Muslims had first, about 1,000 years before Samuel Huntington began to talk about it. So anyway, the transformation of the teaching of revelation from a religion of peace to a religion of war and conquest, using this ideology, using the abrogation of the peace verses, the ideology of the inevitable clash between Darul Islam and Darul Harb, was also strengthened by, I believe, the fabrication of certain hadiths, which also imparted to the teaching of Islam a kind of militant aura. And let me just give you a couple of examples. One of the hadiths says that the Prophet allegedly said, or the hadith says, God bless Prophet Muhammad, who was sent with a sword as a mercy to mankind. Okay. Now, notice the word sword in hadith. Now, this hadith sounds very similar to a Quranic verse where Allah says in Surah 21, Anbiya, verse 107, the verse says, وَمَا أَرْسَلْنَاكَ إِلَّا رَحْمَةً لِلْعَالَمِينَ. We have not sent you but as a mercy to all the worlds. So notice the difference between these two statements. The Quran does not mention the verse. It is very peaceful, but the Hadith mentions the words. It is quite militant. You can see the contrast. Hadith is warlike, the Quran is peaceful. Another hadith that kind of supports the expansion of the Muslim realm at the expense of the Darul Harb is a hadith where the Prophet allegedly said that I was ordered to fight people until they all say La ilaha illallah. Now that sounds like a pretty general command to continue fighting until the whole world is basically converted to Islam. I don't think this is what the Quran teaches. What do you think? Thank you very much. Assalamu alaikum.